Before I get into that, I think there's a little bit of background that's required. You know, I know that as a public broadcaster, you expect us to be telling you the truth, and we'd stop doing that. And there was another number of stories that I had put forward that were blocked, but it seemed to me, as a journalist who'd been there 34 years, it's like the rules had changed overnight. And it changed so quickly that it left me just dizzy in disbelief. I was blocked and prevented from doing stories that I'd pitched, that I'd put forward. They never saw the light of day. They never made it to air or print. So I had witnessed in a very short time the collapse of journalism, news gathering, investigative reporting, and the way I saw it is that we were in fact pushing propaganda. And to define propaganda, it's information, ideas, opinions, or images that give one part of an argument, which are broadcast, published, in order to influence a person's opinion. And mental health workers have their own definition of propaganda as manipulative persuasion in the service of an agenda.
Marianne, my understanding is, and it might be easier for you to give the highlights, but I'll try and go through some of them, but you have been a veteran senior reporter for the CBC, which for our international participants is the Canadian Broadcast Corporation, for 34 years. And as a journalist, you've been involved in all aspects of news gathering and investigative reporting for radio, television, web live reporting, short and long form documentaries. You have been involved with current affairs as a current affairs news anchor for radio and television. You filed stories nationally for World Report, The World This Weekend, and the Hourlies. You've basically done regional stories published on CBC National's digital platform. And the highlights could go on and on. Are there any other highlights that you'd like to just kind of describe your career? Because you've been at this for 34 years, and there's, I've got a whole, just so people know, a whole list of highlights. I just don't know which ones to touch.
The only other thing I'd want to touch on is the year I left, I was given an award for a series I pitched on pandemic perspectives. And the piece that won the award was a homeless person's perspective of how their life had changed. So that was a national award.
Good. Now you're here basically to share your experiences while you were still at the CBC and working as a reporter, and some of the stories you tried to run and what happened. So I'm wondering if you can just start into that, and then if we need any clarifications or that, I'll jump in.
Okay. Before I get into that, I think there's a little bit of background that's required. You know, I know that as a public broadcaster, you expect us to be telling you the truth, and we'd stop doing that. And there was another number of stories that I had put forward that were blocked, but it seemed to me, as a journalist who'd been there 34 years, it's like the rules had changed overnight. And it changed so quickly that it left me just dizzy in disbelief. I was blocked and prevented from doing stories that I'd pitched, that I'd put forward. They never saw the light of day. They never made it to air or print. And some of those stories were protests against vaccine mandates, people's safety concerns about the vaccines, and also the many problems with reporting adverse reactions in Canada. And for me, what was so disorienting about this was that, you know, I had learned from the best of the best at the CBC. This is where I learned to think critically and fearlessly hold power to account, to break stories and uncover information that you, the public, has a right to know. And I also would like to mention that the newsroom I worked in CBC Manitoba, that they were a leader in investigative journalism across the entire network, second only to Toronto. And this was a newsroom that produced award-winning stories that sparked change at the highest level of corporations and government. By the time I left in December of 2021, I no longer recognized the CBC. And I really didn't think my career would end this way, that the skills I learned and honed at the CBC would be used to hold power to account within the corporation.
Can I just slow you down? Because I think it's important for people to understand what you're saying, and especially because you were working as a journalist and then as an investigative reporter for much of the 34 years. So my understanding is that when you're a senior reporter like yourself, you can just follow a story, like, okay, I'm going to report on this, and you can do the story, and generally speaking, you're not second-guessed or your story isn't changed. So your experience in learning from true journalists in the past was just to run a story, to be fair, and that was your experience until COVID hit.
Absolutely. I would say, like, prior to COVID, I was expected to come into that editorial meeting. I would have 2 or 3 original stories, what we call enterprising journalism, original stories, and I was able to work on those unless there was big breaking news that day. But normally I would be assigned that story, given the time, and within, a day or two, I could turn those stories around on all 3 platforms, radio, TV, and web. And I would also like to mention that I had 1 producer vetting for TV and radio. And rarely were there any changes made in my script or the content. And for web, it was another producer, but it was minor things like, let's move this sentence, let's change this word, we'll tighten the lead. That was prior to COVID.
So, and I'll just follow up on that again, because I think it's important for people to understand. So basically your stories were standing as you made them.
Absolutely. And they backed me in doing that. I was supported in doing it. That's what they wanted, original, enterprising journalism.
Okay, and so that ties into when you're saying the Manitoba News Desk at the CBC prior to COVID. I mean, that was a hardcore journalistic news desk. They were expecting you to get, truthful, fair stories, and they were not censoring, they were wanting the news.
That's the way it was prior to COVID.
Okay, and so COVID, that was a completely new ball game when COVID hit. So even the swine flu, like, because we experienced that, during your career.
Yes.
None of this. It just started with COVID.
No, it changed so quick that it left me spinning. And I mean, the way I saw it. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a synopsis, and then I'll get into specifics in terms of what was done with my stories. But that we betrayed the public. We broke their trust. And we had been riding on a reputation of excellence for years, and now we were quickly shutting down one side of the debate. And how were we doing that? We branded the doctors and the experts the CBC chose that we used in our stories. We branded them as competent and trustworthy, and those who questioned and challenged the narrative were portrayed as dangerous and spreading disinformation. And that was regardless of what their specialty was, what their background was, and what their experience was. And I just also want to sort of give you a window into how this affected me personally. As a veteran journalist, I had solid contacts in the community. I had people calling me with stories. So I was seeing and I was hearing and I was absorbing all their stories of suffering and pain, and they were sharing them with me, and these stories weren't being told. Some of those were from injured. Some were from people who had lost their job because of their vaccination status. Those whose families had been blown apart and they'd been ostracized. University students who were depressed over repeated lockdowns and mandates, and parents who were calling me that were agonizing on whether they should vaccinate their child or not. So all these stories were sitting inside of me. They were left with me, and I felt the crushing burden and the weight of their truth not being given a voice. And it affected my well-being because these people trusted me, and I felt I had failed them and I had let them down.
So can I just interject? So when you're a journalist and people are coming to you with stories that should be reported, you're feeling a responsibility to give voice to those stories, but you're not being allowed to do so for the first time, and that's what was causing the distress internally.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I was losing sleep. It was distressing. It was like I had failed these people as a journalist to give voice to their truth. So I had witnessed in a very short time the collapse of journalism, news gathering, investigative reporting, and the way I saw it is that we were in fact pushing propaganda. And to define propaganda, it's information, ideas, opinions, or images that give one part of an argument, which are broadcast, published, in order to influence a person's opinion. And mental health workers have their own definition of propaganda as manipulative persuasion in the service of an agenda.